Hello everyone, I am making a video again. This time I'm actually not in my usual space, as you can probably tell, and that's because I'm at a residency. You see, I'm a writer and a translator. Sometimes I make weird YouTube videos, and I'm also a reader. Not as avid as I'd like to be, mind you, because I just have a lot to do at the moment, at least. Writing is a little bit fickle in that regard. So it really depends on whether or not your writing is sought after at the moment, whether or not there are translation jobs available, at least here in Germany where I write and translate. I write in both English and German. And in Germany, at least, only 5% of writers can live off of their writing. Now, as you've seen from the title of this video, it's a little bit provocative perhaps, but I really do believe that there is no such thing as a good book. What do I mean by that? I just think there's no such thing as objectively good. And the reason for making this video is actually that I've seen a couple of people in the bookstagram and booktube sphere talk about either the fact that there are objective benchmarks for writing, which I fundamentally disagree with, and which I'll get to in a moment, and on the other hand, that reviews are for readers. And I'll start with the first point. I don't really believe that writing is fundamentally objective. Of course, you can learn how to write in a specific way, right? The idea we have about good writing stems from the environment we grew up in. In German, we'd call this canon, so canonically good writing. The classics, if you will. In the English sphere, you'll have something like Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters or Shakespeare, for example, and they constitute this classical notion of what is considered good writing. But it doesn't account for the fact that what we consider to be good writing is in fact very much dependent on the context of where that writing took place. So our love of Shakespeare, for example, is very much the result of it being taught in institutions, of it being framed as the prime example of good and proper English language, of Shakespeare being framed as the great wordsmith. And of course, you can make that argument for sure. I really like Shakespeare's work. Othello, for example, is one of my favorite plays ever. Still, Shakespeare is not inherently good or a great benchmark of writing. He's only that great benchmark because we make him out to be that great benchmark of writing. I'd like to point you towards Carl Kalgren's last video that covers Shakespeare in particular in the context of how Shakespeare is being used by conservatives to get rid of any sense of diversity within the writing sphere. That's also part of the reason why I don't believe that there is objective writing, because the people who decide what writing counts as objective oftentimes are people that are interested in preserving a status quo. So in Europe and North America especially, these are predominantly white individuals still, and mostly male. And it is extremely difficult as a writer of color to have your stories heard. And if you happen to belong to multiple identity categories, I really don't like identity politics for a variety of reasons, none of which align with conservatives' reasons for not liking them. But in my case, for example, I'm not white and I'm not a man, and therefore the writing I have to offer often looks for an audience that's similar to me in a way, right? So I write for that audience. And you can only be one thing in the publishing market, which I gather is similar in the English-speaking market, but not as much as in the German-speaking market. So, for example, individuals who are not white but are male oftentimes can sell their books or their stories, at least in a specific context, much more easily than, for example, women who are not white. But that depends, right? So, for example, if that woman is considered traditionally beautiful or especially beautiful, then that will supersede, oftentimes, identity barriers. And if you have, for example, a non-traditionally attractive, let's say, Black woman writing, there can only be like one or two of those that are allowed, and that covers the entire experience of the Afro-diasporic community in Germany, which of course is not fair at all. Right, so my point is that there are people who are in charge of deciding what good literature is and what marginalized positions have to write about in order for that to count as good literature as well. And given these facts, there is no such thing as objectively good literature or, in fact, objectively bad literature, right? Even though that point might be a little bit more difficult to get across if you think of recent drama in the English-speaking book world, like, for example, Audrey Winter's Age of Scorpius, where people will, of course, say, well, that's an example of really bad writing, of derivative writing. And I would tend to agree, but in a way, it's because that what she was trying to achieve with her writing was not what she intended. So there is more of a disconnect there, rather than that I think the writing itself was necessarily the worst writing that's ever been in existence, right? So perhaps what constitutes good writing, or what people mean, is that the writer has a certain intention or intentionality, and they are able to bring that across. An example of non-standard writing being applied in that way, of course, is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. So in that book, Alice Walker employs non-standard language use because the main character at the beginning is not able to speak standard English. So they have this it's from the perspective of this enslaved woman who was taught to read and write, but she writes in her own vernacular, of course, and it's non-standardized writing, obviously, and it's perhaps not what from a white Western perspective would be considered the standard or good writing. But it is very intentional. One argument that I often see when it comes to stating that there is such thing as objectively good literature is that people will go, or I've seen this at least in some reviews, people will say something along the lines of, if there were no objective criteria, if all reviews were entirely and wholly subjective, there wouldn't be literature prizes. And I think that's fairly naive, because of course the people who are in juries and who decide these things, right? The people who decide who gets a prize oftentimes are very much part of the establishment, and they uphold a certain status quo, and change comes about fairly slowly. And so saying that prizes are a benchmark of what is objectively good literature denies the fact that prizes are part of a very neoliberal system of merit, and who is part of that system and who is not. So I, of course, need, for example, residencies. I need prizes to exist as a writer, as a translator. But I wouldn't say because I've won a certain number of prizes or I've won a certain number of residencies that my writing therefore is objectively better than that of a person who has not won these things, because it's dependent on a lot of different aspects, right? So saying that there's objectively good literature because objectively good literature win prizes fails to account for the distribution of power that exists in our cultural world, worldwide, and in individual countries. So that's the backdrop. Now, why would I say then that reviews are not for readers? Well, there's a reason that people say this, of course. There's a reason why people go, oh, reviews are for readers. And that's because there's been a lot of drama around writers going into review sections or or attacking reviewers in newspapers, etc. There's a long tradition of that, of writers attacking people who just didn't like their book. And that, of course, is petty nonsense, because not everyone is going to like your book. It's a fact of life. Sometimes a lot of people may not like your book. Sometimes a lot of people will. And you have to be able as a writer to deal with that. So I think that's where this comes from, this idea of, well, reviews are not for writers, they're for readers, or reviews are for readers. But in the world that we live in, where reviews are monetized oftentimes, especially on BookTube and Bookstagram, I don't think the reviewers necessarily only review to get their subjective opinion out there, because otherwise they just put it up on Goodreads, right? I also sometimes review books, and I review them fairly publicly, either because I want to push a writer who's still fairly small, whom I really, really love. In Germany, we have a big problem with what is considered serious fiction being very much apart from genre fiction, which is not as much a problem in the English-speaking sphere. As I said, I also write in English, and English is also my second native language, so I have a particular understanding of both the German-speaking publishing industry and sphere and the way that books tend to be written if they are aiming for a certain section of publishing. And I also have that knowledge for the German publishing industry as well. So I can speak from those two vantage points. And I would say that in both cases, both in the English-speaking sphere and now gradually in the German-speaking sphere as well, in the last couple of years, we've had an increase of romantasy and romance books on the market as a direct result of reviews and reviewers loving specific kinds of books, or at least putting their opinions on these books online. And recently there's been a discourse on whether or not that's particularly beneficial. Book Talk in particular has come under a lot of fire for promoting the wrong books. While I do think there are some issues with Book Talk in particular, and I have big issues with, for example, Alchemized, which is another topic altogether. I just really don't think that fan fiction should be monetized, because if you start writing fan fiction with the intent of someday getting that fan fiction published, it's not, at least in my opinion, what fan fiction should be, because it's a way of interacting with a pre-existing medium and with other fans, and it can be a form of resistance to narratives that are standard, that are canon, etc. And by publishing fan fiction, you completely get rid of that aspect. So yeah, that's why I don't think fan fiction should be traditionally published. But that's not the prime reason why I think that reviews are not only for readers, right? They are for reviewers first and foremost, in my opinion. They are very much what gets those reviewers clout and reach, and it's a source of income at some point. So any reviewer who tells me that reviews are for readers and then continues into bashing a book for views, I think that's a bit not necessarily dishonest, but I don't think you're being completely 100% honest with yourself. Because, of course, writers don't need to look at reviews. It's not for them necessarily. If they want to, it's none of their business to go into people's reviews and tell them why they're wrong. Because, of course, people will not, as I said, always like your output, and that's completely fine. But of course, reviewers influence other readers, and if they have big YouTube accounts, if they have big TikTok accounts, if they have big Instagram accounts, that effect has a direct impact on obfuscating, if at the same time they believe that there is such a thing as an objective benchmark for good or bad literature, of obfuscating certain writers. And oftentimes those writers will be those who are marginalized anyways. So especially women of color who write, and especially Black women, and especially dark-skinned Black women. Right. So yes, there's no such thing as an objectively good book.